Good afternoon. I'm Hallie Jackson in Washington, and we are coming on the air with live coverage of the fallout from last night's historic American strikes on those Iranian nuclear facilities as the U.S. enters the war now between Israel and Iran with the bombing of those nuclear sites. It's the first time the U.S. has ever bombed Iran directly in such a manner. The Pentagon today calling this Operation Midnight Hammer and revealing some new information about how this attack unfolded with 30,000-pound so-called bunker buster bombs capable of destroying targets deep underground. The defense secretary and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying the Iranian nuclear program was damaged, was devastated by the attack, with officials calling it the biggest B-2 strike in American history, with still some questions today about what that damage really looked like and how this affected Iranian nuclear capabilities. The Trump administration is making clear their goal has not been regime change, but instead the destruction of these nuclear capabilities, with some of these comments here from Vice President Vance this morning. Listen to this.
We're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program. What we did is we destroyed the Iranian nuclear program. I think we set that program back substantially, and we did it without endangering the lives of the American pilots.
Right now, you've got the American military bracing for potential retaliation from Iran, with senior White House and defense officials saying the next 48 hours in particular are what they are watching most closely. Just moments ago, we saw the Department of Homeland Security out with a new bulletin warning of a heightened threat environment after the strikes. Here's the question, though. What does such a retaliation look like? Would it target Americans overseas? Iran has threatened that. Specifically, they have threatened targeting U.S. military bases in the region. Could there be some kind of domestic component as well? We're going to get into all of it with our team coverage this afternoon. But I want to start with our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. And, Peter, on this topic of retaliation, the president is again making clear late this afternoon that depending on the Iranian response, the U.S. is prepared to strike again, perhaps even more forcefully. Peter.
That's exactly right. We first heard that warning from President Trump in those remarks to the country and to the world last night from here at the White House, again posting via social media, making clear that any retaliation will be met with strikes and attacks of far greater force going forward. The president saying that Iran is the bully of the Middle East initially, and saying any future strikes would be greater and would be much easier, saying that they could happen within minutes. So that's the key top line as we focus on the issue of retaliation here. Hallie, you pointed out the Department of Homeland Security saying that its threat level hasn't changed formally, but that there is a heightened threat preparedness situation taking place right now as they anticipate the potential for some kind of response. The question is, in what form does that response take place? Will it be Iran itself that tries to retaliate? Would it be Iranian proxies, where there is real concerns we are hearing, not just within the Pentagon, but here at the White House, about the potential that proxies, Iranian proxies, try to target not just American interests in that region, but American troops that are either at bases in places like Iraq or perhaps in Qatar and UAE, or some other sites that may not have the level of protection that you find in places like Syria there. Separately, there is the issue of us first learning about the secretive strikes and now learning about the success of them. The president touting in a declaration that this was incredibly successful. He said that the three nuclear sites, Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, that, of course, is the one we've been speaking about most often, most recently, because it is buried deep beneath a mountain, that they were a complete success and that they were completely and totally obliterated. A bit of a nuance in the language we're hearing from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, today, Hallie, saying that they were severely damaged. It caused severe damage and destruction. He wouldn't go as far as to say they were totally obliterated, acknowledging those are the initial damage assessments before they can have a final damage assessment. If they were completely obliterated, it's going to take a bit of time and some intelligence here. And then, of course, there is the political fallout to all of this. There has been some back and forth. Democrats, obviously, greatly frustrated that lawmakers were not included in the decision-making process before the president launched these strikes on Iran. We have heard from some on the left, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, among others, saying this was unconstitutional and saying, in fact, that the president's decision is, in her words, grounds for impeachment. J.D. Vance, the vice president, speaking out today, and you detailed this as well, but I think it's going to get a lot of attention because he said that this is not a strike on Iran. It is a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, its nuclear capabilities, whether those two, whether there is a distinction without a difference there or whether Iran views it that way. I think that is going to draw a lot of attention as we look ahead going forward, Hallie.
Peter, you talk about some of the domestic political fallout as well, and President Trump is wading into that in that new online post just minutes ago that you referenced, going after Republican Senator Thomas Massie. Massie, of course, who has come out over the course of the last 15 hours or so, questioning the constitutionality of the president's strike, going on TV, for example. He's somebody who has co-sponsored, along with a Democratic member of Congress, this piece of legislation that would require presidents to come before Congress before taking an act or making a strike like this one. You're seeing the president attack Massie here, even in this moment of intense sort of national security peril. Talk through some of that piece of it, Peter, because it seems like that will begin bubbling over in the days to come as well.
Hallie, you're right. Thomas Massie is not a name that most Americans are familiar with, but he does represent publicly a view that many, even within the MAGA world, can appreciate. There are strong divisions within the Make America Great movement between this idea of the president attacking a foreign country like Iran, given the fact throughout his campaign he said that it was his primary goal, his priority to keep America out of foreign wars. At the same time, the White House says the president has also made clear that it has been his declaration throughout, even as a candidate, that he would not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So then the next question becomes, how close was Iran to the capability to have a nuclear weapon? The White House and Pentagon secretary have said that they had everything they needed to produce a nuclear weapon, but to be clear, they hadn't produced the weapon itself, with the intelligence community saying it could be as long as a year or perhaps even more, frankly, for that successful effort to weaponize the bomb, to be able to put that nuclear weapon atop an actual bomb itself. As it goes to the politics here, Steve Bannon notably was one of those last individuals to meet with the president. Speaking to him on Thursday, you and I both have watched Steve Bannon's public comments about this. He has been very clear in his conversations with the president and publicly that he disagreed with the idea of the U.S. getting involved here. He had a pre-scheduled visit with the president on Thursday, roughly around the time that the president made clear that he was going to give the Iranians, within 2 weeks, as he described it, a time frame for him to make a decision whether or not the U.S. would get directly involved here, clearly, or perhaps not clearly, but it appears that that was a decoy, because the first go came from the president on Friday. It was one of 3 separate green lights that he gave to the defense secretary over the course of the next 24 hours or so between Friday and the strikes launching, those B-2 bombers going off and ultimately dropping their munitions on the ground in Iran. Overnight Saturday, early Sunday morning, excuse me, I should say, in Iran, late Saturday night here. And then the only other detail that I think is worth getting into, Hallie, is just the scope, the total complexity, the extraordinary nature, and the choreography associated with this strike here. As it's been detailed now, there were a total of 75 munitions, including, among others, some Tomahawk missiles that were fired from naval submarines there off the coast. In the waters that surround the Middle East. There were 7 of these B-2 bombers that were involved, dropping a total of 14 of these 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs that had never been used before in combat, despite preparations for this moment. It's a moment that past presidents had hoped it would not come to, but those are the best details we have about the real complexity. The first set of B-2 bombers that you may remember when you woke up yesterday morning, there were reports that they were heading toward Guam. Those, it appears, were a decoy, as the other B-2 bombs that were involved in the actual strikes headed east, refueling along the way. That's why there were 125 total aircraft involved for this very, very complex operation, Hallie.
Peter Alexander, live for us there on the North Lawn of the White House. Peter, thank you. We'll check back in with you in just a little bit. I want to bring in our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube, who's live for us at the Pentagon. So, Court, you heard Peter talk about the complexity of this operation. the weapons used, these highly sophisticated bunker buster bombs, intentionally meant to get deep into this sort of underground, built inside of a mountain, nuclear facility that Iran has. And this question now of just how much damage did those bombs do, not just in Fordo, but in these other two Iranian nuclear sites as well. The full assessment, we know, is going to take some time here, but what are you hearing from sources about the devastation or the destruction of Iranian nuclear capabilities?
Yeah, definitely damaged. And we even heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that it was badly damaged, Fordo as well as the other two sites. But as far as a final or a full battle damage assessment, that generally will take several days, especially when you're talking about some place like Iran, Hallie. It's not a place where the U.S. has ground troops or people on the ground who can move in and get eyes on and get photos and do a firsthand assessment of what happened. They're going to rely more on satellite imagery and on overhead assessment. And that's simply just going to take some time. They'll also, I'm sure, use other intelligence gathering methods to figure that out. But you mentioned the complexity of this mission, and that is absolutely the case here. A couple of points just to show just how complex it was. This was only 25 minutes total time on station for all of these 75 munitions to be dropped. So what that means is they had to coordinate launching those Tomahawks, the T-LAMs, from the submarine they launched more than an hour before the bombs actually dropped from those B-2 bombers. Now, in addition to the bombers, the 125 aircraft, yeah, they were using a number of aerial refuelers, but there were also fighter jets that were up there. Hallie, this is fascinating. They went ahead of the bomber package so that they could essentially draw fire or draw attention from any possible air defense systems on the ground, or if the Iranians scrambled any kind of military jets, they would go towards those fighter jets, and the bombers would be able to continue on and continue their mission, dropping those bombs over Fordo and over Natanz. That is a fascinating detail and not something that we often hear in a mission like this.
But yet, Courtney, it doesn't appear from what we've heard from top military officials that Iran had any response at all. To their knowledge, there were no shots fired, nothing fired at the incoming or outgoing planes at any point through this operation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one reason that they may not have detected them is, number one, a lot of these are stealth capabilities, right? The B-2 bomber, the fighter jets that were likely used were probably had a stealth capability as well. But it's not just that. Remember, back in October, Israel took out a lot of Iran, maybe all of Iran's strategic air defense systems, damaging just about every one of their systems. They've been trying to build it back, but officials don't believe that they were fully back online. And then even just in the last 10 days or so, Israel has also gone after more of their air defense systems, including radars, including the launchers. So they may not have had much of the ability, even if they were able to detect these aircraft, to do anything about it. But I think it is notable that they did not scramble any of their military jets in response to what were potentially dozens of U.S. aircraft breaching Iranian airspace.
Courtney Kube, live for us there at the Pentagon. Court, thank you very much for your reporting on this. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is live for us in the region. He is in Tel Aviv. Richard, a couple of things for you here. When we talk about the Iranian response, so much of that response will dictate where things go after the next maybe 48, 72 hours or so. Talk through some of the options that Iran has, ranging from what they have already suggested they may do, and that is potentially go after U.S. troops in the region. You're seeing the U.S. issue these very intense warnings, including from the Secretary of State, that to do that would bring essentially more fire upon Iran, would bring an even stronger U.S. response than what we've already seen. And then there's this discussion about potentially closing the Strait of Hormuz, which would have a massive impact on commercial shipping around the world.
So let's start with what Iran possibly could do in the short term and what it is threatening to do and what it has threatened to do in the past. And its options are limited because, by the way, today, all day, the Israeli military has been pounding Iran, has been following on from these American strikes. Just a short while ago was an announcement that the Israeli military bombed a missile engine production facility for the IRGC, so the engines for those ballistic missiles that are flying at Israel. And there were more Iranian missiles that were fired at Israel today, just shortly after the U.S. strikes. So there already has been a kind of response against Israel with almost 30 ballistic missiles fired at Haifa and Tel Aviv, causing dozens of injuries, no reports of fatalities at this stage. Israel is already in a state of heightened alert. But will they go after the United States despite these very overt, very clear, very bellicose threats from President Trump and his administration? They can't attack the United States directly with any military power. They don't have jets with the kind of range to attack the United States. They don't have missiles that could reach the United States, which leaves potential terrorism as an option to hit the U.S., or more likely the concern is some sort of action in the region, either by Iran or one of their proxies. But it is a very different situation now than it was a few years ago. Hezbollah, Hallie, their most powerful proxy. We've been talking about Hezbollah for years. A Hezbollah spokesman just said a short while ago that they don't want part of this fight. They're going to stick to the terms of the ceasefire. The spokesman said that Iran is a powerful country enough it can defend its own interests. We are going to stick by our ceasefire. That would have been an unimaginable statement from Hezbollah a year or two ago before it was decimated in Lebanon. Hezbollah was the main sword that was hanging over Israel's neck, wielded by Iran, and that sword has been broken in half. So the ability of the militias to respond is limited. Iraqi militias have threatened to attack U.S. bases. They say they have a plan to do that. There is a Hezbollah version in Iraq, specifically, that has promised a reprisal. They say they could target American aircraft flying in the skies over Iraq. So there is a possibility that one of these groups could act with or without coordination with Iran, by the way. These militias operate autonomously. They can raise their own funding. They are supported by Iran, but they aren't entirely dependent, and they aren't entirely dependent on, especially now that Iran's resources are diminished. In terms of the Strait of Hormuz, do you want to get into that? That was a statement from a member of parliament suggesting that Iran's response would be to close the Straits of Hormuz. Well, you cover parliament in the United States. They can say anything they want. Right now, the Iran has taken a humiliating blow. The American planes were crisscrossing the skies, and the Iranian military didn't even respond. So, of course, Iranian lawmakers are going to be threatening fire and brimstone. Will they carry it out? Even this lawmaker said, this is what we would like to do, is close the Straits of Hormuz, but it's a decision for the supreme leader. It's a decision for the ultimate Security Council. So their capacity and their willingness potentially to carry out something, I think, is not necessarily what it was before. And also, I think we've been looking at the Middle East for long enough to realize that this region views time very differently. The Americans keep asking about what's going to happen in the next 48 hours, 72 hours. The bigger concern, how a country like Iran waits it out, how the Taliban waited it out. They have presence. They are in the region. They have history in the region. They wait it out. They play the long game. How is this going to end in 10 years, 15 years? I think that's probably the bigger question, and one that Iranians are thinking about. How they respond immediately, if they respond at all, and how do they turn this around in the long term, the way it turned around in their favor in Iraq and ultimately turned around in the favor of the Taliban in Afghanistan.
You also have the response from others in the international community, Richard, from Europe, for example, where you have heard about this de-escalation, to China, to Russia, which is involved, of course, in its own war in Ukraine as well.
So China and Russia have been the only countries. They're both allies of Iran. They both, not ideological allies, but they have mutual interests, and they're very pragmatic. China gets oil from Iran very cheaply because Iranian oil is tainted. It is sanctioned, so therefore they have to sell it at a great discount to China, and China it benefits immensely from that. Russia gets drones from Iran, and they benefit immensely from that because they ran out of artillery a long time ago, firing it at Ukrainian soldiers, so they're using Iranian drones. They have both come out and condemned this action, with China specifically calling on Israel to come up and step forward and achieve a ceasefire. But neither of them have said that they're going to get involved in this militarily, that they're going to put any skin in the game. They're just calling for a ceasefire and an end to this military action.
So, Richard, as you look at your reporter's notebook, so to speak, and your point is taken here on Iran looking at this in a long-term time frame here over the course of years, if not decades, versus the U.S., and I think at the moment looking at days and weeks. What is the next shoe to drop that you are waiting for, that you are watching to see?
Well, I think it would be do one of these militia groups. Oh, I forgot to mention the Houthis. There are quite a few proxies, not nearly as many as before and not nearly as powerful as they were before. The Houthis are promising some sort of reprisal. So they have gone on the record, so to speak, more brave than the other militias. But the ones that are on the record this far, Hezbollah in Iraq and the Houthis saying that they will act in some capacity at a time and place of their choosing. I think it's very possible that they do. I think it's very possible that Iran does fire on an American base, potentially trying to do some sort of symbolic attack. Maybe they fire on an empty base, hoping that it sends a message to their military that they haven't given in completely, but fall short of the threshold of provoking a U.S. response. That's what they did after the death of Qasem Soleimani. But it was very dangerous. I was there on the base shortly after the Iranians fired ballistic missiles at the Al-Assad base, and no Americans were killed, and President Trump called off a reprisal. But it was very close. There were several contractors who were concussed and were very close. And had they not been sort of standing behind certain pieces of reinforced concrete, they would have been dead. There was a mess hall that almost got hit by one of these incoming ballistic missiles. So if Iran, even back then, had fired this missile a few inches to the left or right, it could have suffered an enormous reprisal. So I'd be surprised right now if Iran, in these next day, I'm often surprised, so it could happen, but I would be surprised if in this day or two, while they're still under attack, decide to take on the U.S. directly, maybe let one of their last surviving proxies that is already promising to do it try something. At least they have the air of deniability.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.